All right, let's dive right into this explainer and look at how Charles Darwin actually built his incredibly watertight case for evolution. You know, when we think of Darwin today, we usually picture this young, adventurous guy on a ship in the exotic jungles of South America, or maybe studying finches on the remote Galapagos Islands. But honestly, that is only part of the story. To truly understand how he proved his massive theory, we have to start somewhere much less exotic, but completely familiar to his audience. We're talking about right at home, on the farm. So let's decode the brilliant step-by-step logical deduction that literally changed the world.
From the exact moment he returned from his famous voyage, Darwin was absolutely obsessed with what he called the mystery of mysteries. He just couldn't accept the prevailing scientific assumption of his day. People basically thought perfectly adapted species were just independently created out of nowhere, completely disconnected from one another. He knew there had to be general laws governing the natural world, just like there are for physics or astronomy. But actually proving it? Well, he knew that was going to take an incredibly rigorous argument.
And because of that, he was incredibly methodical. He agonized over this theory with immense patience. He started collecting his facts way back in 1837, sketched out his ideas around 1844, and then he basically just sat on it. He took over 2 decades to meticulously build this logical deduction piece by piece. In fact, he might have just kept tweaking it forever if pressure from a colleague, Alfred Russel Wallace, who actually arrived at the exact same idea independently, hadn't forced his hand to finally publish in 1859.
Okay, moving into Section 1, the power of domestication, focusing on clues from the far.
To introduce this grand, world-shattering theory, Darwin didn't start with complex fossil records or exotic birds. He pointed to something his 19th century audience already intimately understood: domestic breeding. He knew that to prove nature could shape species over millions of years, he first had to show that humans could shape them in just a few lifetimes. So to prove this, Darwin literally became a pigeon fancier. Think about the wild rock pigeon. It's a fairly standard slaty blue bird with black wing bars. Now compare that to the results of exhaustive pigeon breeding. Darwin showed that wildly bizarre birds, like the fantail, which has 40 tail feathers instead of the usual 12, or the pouter with its huge inflated crop, or the carrier with those elongated eyelids. All of these miraculously descended from that single wild rock pigeon. If you took these bizarre variants and showed them to an ornithologist out in the wild, they'd confidently classify them as entirely different species.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that humans have this kind of superpower, accumulative selection. By consciously picking slight variations over successive generations, mating the bird with a slightly larger tail with another bird with a slightly larger tail, humans can summon completely new forms into existence. It's not magic, but as Darwin put it, it acts like a magician's wand. He established that biological form is highly plastic, and selection is the tool that shapes it.
Which brings us to Section 2, variation in the wild. Let's look at the blurred lines in nature. Having proved that selection definitely works on a farm, Darwin now had to prove that the raw material for selection, which is variation, actually exists out in the wild, completely without human interference. Because think about it, if wild animals are exact clones of each other, there's nothing for nature to select. He started by deeply examining how naturalists classify plants and animals, and he found a lot of disagreement. He noted that the line between a mere variety of an animal and a true species is completely blurred. Experts were constantly arguing over whether a slightly different bird on a neighboring island was just a local variety or a brand new species. Darwin realized this confusion was actually the key. Varieties are simply new species in the making. He called them incipient species.
And this brilliantly illustrates his next big finding. The most flourishing, dominant, and widespread species are exactly the ones acting as active manufactories for new variations. The larger the population and the wider it spreads, the more slight variations it produces. Nature, just like the pigeon breeder's coop, is constantly throwing out slight, inheritable differences.
All right, Section 3, the struggle for existence. Let's do the math of survival.
Okay, so we've established we have variation in nature. But since nature doesn't have a human breeder picking out the best pigeons, Darwin needed a mechanism. What acts as nature's magician's wand to rigorously preserve the good traits and destroy the bad ones? To answer this, he applied the economist Thomas Malthus's mathematics of human population directly to biology. He asked a really powerful hypothetical question. What happens if you take the absolute slowest breeding animal on Earth, the elephant, and let its population grow completely unchecked by death or starvation?
The math on this is absolutely staggering.
He calculated that if just one single pair of elephants were left completely unchecked and they bred at their minimum natural rate, their descendants would number 15 million in only 500 years. Just let that sink in.
But obviously we can look outside and see the Earth is not buried under miles of elephants. Why? Well, because of nature's relentless checks on population. There has to be an incredibly severe, constant struggle for life that aggressively checks these explosive powers of increase. We're talking massive destruction of seeds and eggs, extreme mortality of the young, relentless predators, harsh winters, parasites. Every single organic being is striving to the absolute utmost to increase its numbers, and almost all of them fail. They are destroyed.
Now for Section 4, Nature's Complex Web, exploring the unseen connections.
This brutal struggle we just talked about isn't just a simple, direct fight over a scrap of food. It is an invisible, infinitely complex web that binds vastly different, seemingly unrelated organisms together in a really delicate balance. Darwin provided this stunning example of ecological interconnectedness. Certain beautiful flowers, like the red clover, absolutely require humblebees to pollinate them. But field mice love to destroy humblebee nests. So, what keeps the mice in check? Cats. Therefore, Darwin deduced the sheer existence and abundance of a specific flower, the red clover, is literally determined by the number of feline cats roaming the nearby villages. Change just one variable, and the ripple effects dictate life and death across the entire ecosystem.
Darwin beautifully summarized this incredibly hostile, crowded landscape. He compared the face of nature to a yielding surface with 10,000 sharp wedges packed close together and driven inwards by incessant blows. Basically, every space is filled. To survive, you have to wedge your way in. Therefore, any slight variation, maybe a slightly thicker coat, a slightly longer beak, or a slightly faster running speed that gives an organism an edge in surviving these constant blows, will absolutely determine if it lives long enough to pass on that trait.
And there it is, the inevitable conclusion. This brilliant logical progression, starting from domestic breeding showing how plastic life is, to natural variation providing the raw material, to explosive reproduction creating a severe struggle, inevitably results in natural selection, the survival of profitable variations in the struggle for life. It is an utterly unconscious, relentless, and unceasing process of filtering.
Which leaves us with this final, truly awe-inspiring thought to ponder. If a human being's conscious selection can work such absolute miracles on a farm, literally sculpting a wild pigeon into a wildly feathered fantail in just a few centuries, what could the relentless grinding wedges of natural selection sculpt over the vastness of geological time? The answer, as Darwin famously deduced, is all the magnificent, endless diversity of life on Earth.